Thank you everyone for joining us here in the room and virtually on the live stream. I'm super happy to welcome Susan back to the Bay Area and thank her for sharing her time with us. She is professor of psychology at Williams College, where she's also the founder and director of the Williams program in teaching. She's also the author of The Stories Children Tell, Context is Everything, Real Kids, Red Flags or Red Herrings, and what's available here today, The End of the Rainbow.
One other book, The Hungry Mind.
Oh, and The Hungry Mind. See, there's so many books, I can't even keep track. So some context, I met Susan at the Common Ground series talk earlier this year, and I left that talk uber hopeful, inspired, and eager to put much of what was learned into practice. And one of the great things about working here is, when we meet people outside of here, then we have the opportunity to make these talks happen here and then share the talks with our Google family and then share it with the world on YouTube. So I also wanted to share just personally that as you were speaking, it reminded me of the conversations that I have with my kids at the end of the day. And oftentimes when they're very excited about something, you see this spark in their eyes, like they're about to burst and they can't wait to share what's happened in the day. And I left your talk, how can I felt like I had tools to make that happen more and more.
Great.
So welcome, Susan, and thank you for sharing more with us today.
My pleasure.
So this is going to be very much a Q&A, and if folks have any questions, we don't have a dory, but please share them here or ping a friend that you know that is attending the talk and we will ask. But I want to start off with this picture that some of you can see and some of you may not be able to see, so I will describe it. But it is two little girls really immersed in a moment, looking down. They're sitting outside and they are looking at something intently. And we start our literary journey as children really drawn to picture books, so I thought it would be nice to start our talk with this picture. Fittingly, you brought this picture to share. Can you share more about the story?
I'll tell you the story of this picture. So the smaller blonde girl holding a dandelion, that's me when I was about 3. And the story behind it is that when I was very little, I lived in a very small village called Sagaponack on the eastern end of Long Island. And my stepdad was a potato farmer, and it was incredibly rural. And I had enormous freedom, much more freedom than children do now. I basically rode my little tricycle around the village all day by myself. My mom might say, watch for a car. But that was about it. Then I went off and I visited neighbors and I wandered around, and inevitably I'd end up stopping with my trike by the edge of a potato field because that's what surrounded us. And I'd get off the trike and I'd kneel down. I just loved the potato fields. I loved the smell of dirt. I loved the look of the plants. And I'd kneel down and I'd begin to investigate what was around me. And usually I'd see something called a potato bug. So they are a terrible problem for potato farmers, but a delight for little girls like me. And they look a little bit like ladybugs. They have a hard dome-shaped surface, and they creep along, and I'd watch. I'd get closer and closer. And then typically what would happen is at some point that I could never explain, 2 translucent wings would come out of their dome, and they'd fly. They'd fly from one potato leaf to another. And just as inevitably as they'd make that little flight, I'd reach out and I'd pick one up and I'd bring it close to me, I'd put it in my mouth, and I'd bite it. And the thing about that is I wasn't mean, I certainly wasn't hungry, I just wanted to know what was going on inside. And the reason I tell that story is because virtually every child all over the world starts life with that kind of ravenous appetite for knowledge, for finding things out. It's the engine that drives learning. So when you wonder about how children under the age of 5 can learn as much as they do, they learn more in those first 5 years than we ever learn again in our life. They learn to talk, they learn to navigate the social world, they learn an enormous number of things. Why? Because they're curious about everything. They want to explain everything. They want to understand everything. The question that leads to is, why is this powerful, robust, pervasive characteristic of early childhood, why does it begin to wane as we get older? Why does something that's so sturdy and strong, you just almost can't tamp it down in the 2-year-old? So few of you probably have had 2-year-olds, and some of you are going to have a 2-year-old in the audience, and you will know that you put a 2-year-old in the corner of a room and wait a few minutes, and they'll make their way around the whole room investigating everything. They're like a one-person wrecking crew. And that's because of this enormous drive to find out. So the question that I have spent the last 12 years trying to answer is why it is that such a sturdy characteristic begins to wane and in many children virtually disappears by the time they're in middle school. And that's what led me to the book that Regina mentioned, The Hungry Mind, The Origins of Curiosity in Childhood. I wanted to understand what curiosity was, how it develops, and why, as I said, something so sturdy becomes so fragile.
So what inspired this latest book? Because as you mentioned, you've written all of these others, and I'm thinking there may be a story.
There is. There's a story for everything. About 12 years ago, I was working with I co-founded an experimental school for children. And that was about 18 years ago, but about 12 years ago, I was sitting with the faculty, and we were talking about what their goals were for the year. So I was leading them and guiding them. And I said, what is it you want to have happen during the next year? What do you think these kids should be able to do at the end of the year that's different than what they can do now? And the teachers in the school kept saying, it's not how many words they can spell, it's not how many math facts they can solve in 30 minutes, it's not how many states in the country they can locate on a map on a piece of paper. And what they were referring to were standardized tests, obviously. It's none of those things. That doesn't capture what we're trying to educate our students for. And I kept saying, okay, you don't like those things. What is it you want your children to get out of this experience? And they said each of them had a different answer, but all of the answers ended up coalescing around the idea that they wanted children to be hungry for knowledge. They wanted them to want to find out about the world. They wanted them to want to learn. And I left that meeting thinking, I couldn't get it out of my mind, that what they wanted was for children not only to be curious, but to become more curious as a function of their experience in school. And I thought, I went to a conference actually then on child development, which I do all the time, and I thought, we are a society that measures what we value and values what we measure. And it's all very well for teachers or parents to embrace curiosity or pay lip service to curiosity, but if they're measuring something altogether different, like math facts or spelling, that's what they're going to emphasize in the classroom. And my original idea was, I know, I'll come up with a measure of curiosity and all will be solved and schools will be wonderful and children will go on eating bugs for the rest of their life. Well, that was 12 years ago, and easier said than done. I realized I had to learn a lot about how curiosity develops, what it looks like in the classroom, how it manifests itself, and that's what really led me to 12 years of research and to that book.
So the title of your book, why do you believe it's important for children to teach our kids that the pursuit of happiness is greater than the pursuit of money?
Okay, good question. So this is the other book. I wrote 2 books last year. I don't recommend that. I was very tired at the end of the year. But the book Regina's talking about, The End of the Rainbow, came from the fact that all during that time that I was looking at curiosity and trying to understand it and doing experiments about it, I was thinking about this question of how you measure it. What would be a good measure of it? And somewhere along the way, I thought, I'm like those teachers. I'm not sure standardized tests capture what we think is important. And I actually then did a very careful study of all the existing research looking at what standardized tests predict about a child later on, and it turns out they predict almost nothing. So they're a good sorting system, or good in the sense that they are useful to some people in some settings, but they don't really tell you anything about what you might wish your child or your student or other people's children to get out of school experience. And when I looked into all those studies, what occurred to me is that our ideas about measurement, about educational measurement, are totally linked to our ideas about success, which we've come to define as financial. So kids go to school, they're going to make more money. And the terrible effect of that is that we've come to think of schools as a training ground for work. And that's not what schools should be. So you started with the story about your daughters and how their eyes light up when they're excited about something. Very few people would say that what they hope for most for their child is that they're rich. And if they do think that, they should read the research, which shows that actually having more money doesn't lead to happiness. You need enough money, and going to school, the fact of going to school, ensures that people are more likely to have enough money, to have a house, to have food. So I'm not disparaging the importance of that, but that has nothing to do with what goes on in school. That has to do with going to school. When I began to think about that, I thought, this is not what people want for their children, and it's not good for children to have the school experience shaped by a quest for money and more money, or to have school be shaped by a quest to train people to be good workers. What people really want for their children is to be happy. And as I began to think about that, I began to think, okay, what would that look like? What would a school look like that was educating for happiness, not money? And I came up with an answer of sorts, and that's what the book is about, what a school would look like, what children would be doing if we thought of something other than money as the goal of education.
So if we're thinking about something other than money, and if we're putting curiosity first, how could schools encourage curiosity more in the classroom?
Okay, well, can I give a two-part answer to that?
Yes.
Okay, so so in the book, The End of the Rainbow, one of the things I talk about is curiosity, because in fact, inquiry is at the heart of a full life. Wanting to know things and knowing how to find things out is essential. It's not just essential to be good at your job, it's essential to having a meaningful life. And when people talk about lifelong learning, that's what they're talking about. So curiosity is one of the things that I talk about in The End of the Rainbow. And I can tell you also, I'll answer that part quickly. What would a curious classroom look like? It would be a place where children had plenty of time and encouragement to ask questions, and then just as importantly, to seek answers to those questions. And for some children, that has to do with talk. So one of the best ways to express curiosity is to ask questions. In fact, some of my research, we've looked at the questions kids ask in school, and it turns out that while children at home, when they're 2 and 3, get ready for this, ask anywhere between 26 and 100 questions an hour to their caregiver, their mom, their dad. By the time they get to school, they're more likely to ask about 2 questions per hour. When we looked in schools, we saw an incredible absence of question asking on the part of children. So for many kids, a simple thing is to make lots of time for conversation. Conversation is the single most underrated tool a classroom can have. And children who are privileged, who have come from educated, sort of rich family lives, not money rich, intellectually rich family lives, what makes the difference for them? It's lots of talk. So schools, instead of bypassing that, should replicate it for kids who aren't getting a lot of talk at home. But some kids aren't question askers, and so classrooms need to have all kinds of other opportunities for inquiry. And I bet there are a lot of people who work here at Google who were tinkerers when they were little, like to take things apart, like to peer at things, like to try things out, test the waters, try something a little dangerous and see what happens. And classrooms need to have that. They need time. You cannot ask any researcher, ask people who work here to learn, to find new things out, to make discoveries. You need to get to dead ends, you need to make mistakes, you need to try it again. I needed to eat so many potato bugs when I was little to figure out what was going on. One wasn't enough. So kids need time. They need a chance to pursue things they're really interested in. So we're not all interested in the same thing. And each kid needs to be able to inquire about something they really care about. It's never going to be that one topic or one set of materials is going to work for all children. And finally, they need curious adults around them. So in some of our studies, we've manipulated how the adult is behaving, and it turns out that not only do adults need to encourage curiosity and ask questions and answer questions, they need to be curious themselves. And our research shows that when they are, it has a measurable impact on children's own curiosity. And that has all kinds of interesting implications for teacher preparation, because I don't think teachers get enough chance to pursue their own curiosity. Then there are some other things that I talk about in the end of the rainbow, other qualities that are key to happiness besides curiosity. It's important, but it's not the only thing. So I talk about collaboration, I talk about thoughtfulness, I talk about the love of reading. So there's a whole list, and for each of those there are, and one other thing I'll say that's key to that and related to curiosity, engagement. So I was thinking about this as I was on my way over here today. We think of engagement as a tool to get kids to learn information or learn very specific skills. It's not, it is a tool, but it's not just a tool, it's the goal. Because a person who's capable of being deeply engaged in things that are meaningful is going to be a well-educated grown-up, and they're going to live a much better life. And yes, they'll probably be better at their job, but that's not the main reason for that. So one of the things that's key and very related to curiosity is giving children opportunities to get deeply engaged in something.
Thinking about time, and just, I'm using again the data point of my children, and as I see them go through the grades, they have more time to tinker and explore, in their preschool years versus later. And then I'm just predicting that later on they're going to have even less time. So how do we encourage this with that limiting time that they're going to be facing year over year?
We should change that. I mean, you can't do the things that I'm talking about within the current school setup. The idea that you can do everything, and I hear this all the time. I visit schools all over the country. Yes, we're going to have curious children and children who are deeply engaged and kids who work together. That's a great example. Kids who really help each other and take care of each other. And we're going to get high test scores, and they're going to learn 3 languages, and they're going to ace the SATs or whatever it is. And actually, that's not possible. You pick something and you do it well. Some of the things that are currently valued in school, like the ability to argue well or to do well at your work, I think would come with the things that I'm suggesting. I don't think you'd have to give up all of those aspirations, but you'd have to give up the idea that those should shape the school day. So you cannot learn 27 different things about paper and pencil mathematics, which children currently have to learn, God knows why, and also give children a chance to go deeply into something, ask good questions, tinker. So it's a question of shifting what's important.
What do you think about how we, actually you've been answering this already, but if you want to add more to this, like how we assess success in our schools today? Right.
So, I mean, success, as I said, I would argue has come increasingly to be defined by money and sort of power. I did a study a few years ago with one of my students at Williams. We sent out a survey to parents about what they hoped for their children. And the parents of the younger children said things like, I want my child to be happy, I want them to find love. Turns out that's really important. And I want my child to have something she or he loves to do. When we asked the parents of older children, kids who are like getting near the end of high school, fewer and fewer of them answered that way. They said, it's captured perfectly by one person who answered the survey with 2 words. A lot of people gave a long paragraph about what they wanted for their kid, but this one parent of a 15-year-old had a 2-word answer: med school. So as our children get older, we get more and more focused on certain ideas about what success is. And yet the research, not just from psychologists, but from economists as well, shows pretty clearly that in adult life, those two things don't sync up perfectly. So having the best job or having the most money is not what will make your life most meaningful, most fulfilling, most joyous even. I think our current measures of success in school are pretty impoverished, actually, and they take on a life of their own. They seem meaningful because we treat them as if they're meaningful, but actually the number a kid gets on a paper and pencil test doesn't have much to do with what they're getting out of the school experience, and it has very little to do with what their life will be like when they're older.
Can you talk about any of the gender differences that you've seen in your research?
You know, I haven't seen many gender differences, although it would be very interesting to find out. You know, there are gender differences in terms of early language, so girls tend to talk more, and maybe boys tend, in some research, to sort of be more interested in tinkering or certain kinds of object manipulation. They're not different in terms of their level of curiosity, and that has to do simply with giving kids an opportunity to be curious about the thing they want to be curious about. But within that, there are individual variations. So that's one of the interesting things. Even as adults, I mean, I bet if you did a survey here at Google, you'd find some people are more curious than others. There are important individual differences in levels of curiosity. I don't think they go by gender, but I don't really understand completely what they're related to. There's not a perfect correlation with intelligence either. Part of it has to do with what they experienced when they were young. So in my fantasy school, curiosity would be the goal of the educational process, not a sort of starting point. But even so, at the end of the day, some people would be more passionate seekers of information than others. That's a good thing that we're not all the same.
So how do we balance this curiosity with like the things that our kids need to know, right? Like there's always going to be something that, I want to spend more time on subject X because that's what I'm passionate about. But
what do you think kids need to know?
I mean, it's going to be different answer per job here and per interest, but
I don't think there are many things that all kids need to know. They need to be able to read. I think they need to know how to ask a question, and they need to know the difference between a good question and a weak question. So one of the ideas that I talk about in both books is what it would take to educate for curiosity. Same way, all of these things, collaboration, engagement, they're not just things that you make a beautiful classroom and then those things happen. They require good teachers guiding children in skillful ways. So knowing I'm a researcher, so I can spend years, I did spend years trying to think of the best way to ask my questions about curiosity. And that's true for any of you. You sometimes have to spend time figuring out what your question is. Kids aren't given much practice at refining, revising, re-asking their question. Sometimes you ask the question and a day or a year or 5 years later you think, I have to shift that question a little and I'll get a better answer. So that's part of it. They need to know then how to go about finding the answers they need. Not all questions will lead you towards the same path to get answers. Some questions are more data bound than others, for instance. And then finally, kids need to learn how to decide when their question's been answered. One of the worst mistakes we make in school is to tell them all the time when they've answered the question. How do we tell them? By giving them a score. Instead of asking them, are you satisfied? The beautiful thing about curiosity is the more you know about something, if you're actually interested in it, the more you want to know, because you become attuned to ever deeper levels of information and subtlety. So to answer your question, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but what kids need to know, in my view, it's a very different cluster of things than we tend to think it is. There are very few bodies of knowledge that all children must have in order to be well educated. You know, I play this game with my students at Williams who take a course with me on education. At some point early in the semester, I ask them to think of somebody they know who's really well educated. It could be anybody from their family, from their town, from, you know, their summer job or at school, and they describe the person. And then I say, okay, what is it about that person that makes them seem well educated to you? And I get all these wonderful answers. I get, you know, he's wise, she's eager for knowledge, she can relate to many different people, she's able to collect information and connect it in interesting ways. Students say all kinds of things. I've been doing this game for about, I don't know, 18 years. I've never had a student say he really knows polynomials, or she really can parse the hell out of any sentence. It turns out those aren't the measures of a good education. And yet, it's not that knowledge is unimportant. It's that people get knowledge if they have these other skills. So you must know in your jobs that the things you need to know about are related to the things you must do or want to do. And the question is, are you good at getting that knowledge? So when you say, what is it all kids need to know, I'm not sure there are any bodies of knowledge that all kids must know. And by the way, in our current system, they don't all know it anyway. So even setting it up that way doesn't actually work.
So on the current setup, why do you think we test for what we test for?
Oh boy, wish I knew the answer to that question. It's expedient, and that's, to me, the worst mistake. So let me say that when I started talking about these things in public settings, everybody who agreed with me about the problems of testing, current system of testing, assumed that I meant we shouldn't assess, and I don't mean that at all. We have to assess children, and schools have to be held accountable because we have to know if we're doing a good job or a bad job. I'm all for that. And here's the great news. We're good at measuring a lot of these things. Psychologists have been measuring these things forever. Probably you've had speakers here who talked about things like unconscious bias, unconscious stereotyping, or the impulse to gamble, or what makes us fall in love with the people we fall in love with. Those are all based, those findings, on our ability to measure the invisible or the ineffable. So there are ways to measure what kids are learning or what's going on in a classroom so that we can hold schools accountable. Why we use paper and pencil tests? One, they seem easy, and they create an illusion of hard data, which is a fallacy. Anybody can make a number out of anything. It doesn't mean the number means anything or tells you anything about a person. Honestly, somebody's going to hate me for saying this, but it's turned into a huge business. And it's taken on, like I said before, a life of its own. We believe them. I mean, even in my hometown, everybody says they hate tests, but on the day that the test scores come out, everybody looks to see whether their kids are in the district with the high test scores. And for that minute, when they're looking at the newspaper, they've forgotten that those numbers don't necessarily tell you anything about what those students are getting out of school.
So for parents, right, if I look at a test,
Yeah.
and I can tell, hopefully, say a math test, I know 2 + 2 is 4, but I hear your son is not curious enough or they're not having enough fun in class because the subjective evaluation of a professional, right, I can argue against that a lot more and say, you're wrong, right? My son is curious enough, he's learning, he's connecting the dots, he's engaged, you know, and let's talk to the principal, or I want to talk to the superintendent. I don't believe you. Whereas a 96 on the test, right, or a 40 on the test is evidence that I can't argue against, right? So even if you say we can measure those things for a layperson to have a confidence level in them, you know, it might be easier for us as a parent to understand and for administration to deal with, right?
So I think if I understand what you're asking about, it's, well, even if, you might all disagree with me and think that the current tests work well and the current school system works well, and I'm wrong. So then there's not much discussion about this. But if you agreed with me, and the question is, how do you help a community of people, teachers, administrators, and parents, to make this as firm and convincing and reliable as the number on the test? Is that your question?
We have psychologists here.
But I think that that's where I'm suggesting something different. So in the book, in the last chapter, I talk about very tangible, quantitative ways to measure these things. For instance, I'll give you one very simple example. Conversation, I think, and I've told you this, and research supports this, is key to intellectual development. And kids who get a lot of conversation tend to do better in all kinds of ways, including learning to read better and all kinds of other cognitive tasks than kids who are deprived that kind of exchange. And schools would do well to promote more conversation. Well, we could be measuring the conversations that go on in schools. We could have video cameras taking random samples. That's a common technique in research. You go in and tape record at times that no one's aware you're going to tape record, but everybody knows that will happen at some point. And you take those snippets of conversation and you simply count how many conversations, how long the conversations are, how many turns individual kids get to take. These are all well-established measures from developmental research. They've been around for years, and they end with a number. It's just that it's a number that tells you something more important and probably more valuable than some of the things we're currently assigning a number to. So I don't think it would be adequate for teachers or anybody just to say, in my gut, this kid is really thriving or engaged or intellectual or thoughtful. I think we do have to measure those things in a way that ultimately can be represented in a graph or a number, partly for the reason that you're talking about. Also, people fool themselves. So as a teacher, I had a teacher once say, I don't need those tests. I know in my gut when a kid can read. Well, I loved that particular teacher, but I didn't trust her. We fool ourselves. So we do need objective measures. We just need measures of the things we actually value rather than something altogether different. So I hope that answered your question.
I agree that just not the test scores on math and stuff, but it's easier, especially for less educated parents, right, to potentially have a trust in a math test than video, not understanding that we're going to monitor and capture these things, and do I have to coach my kid to be able, to make sure they're in front of the video engaging during those times or something like that, versus, I trust that the scoring on the test, even if I don't know polynomials as a parent, right, that the school graded those, but the other things feel more subjective, and I can argue. And for the school, it's easier to point to, no, they failed the test, rather than these squishier things that are really important versus just math mechanics.
Right. I mean, the trouble is those tests have been around a long time, and everyone has gotten used to the idea that they're trustworthy. And so that partly is going to take time. If, let's say, in my dream world, a bunch of schools said, let's get rid of these measures, let's use these measures, let's educate for these goals, it would take some time. I'm guessing it wouldn't take as much time as people think, especially if your kids came home interested and engaged and happy, and you had these measures that said, and some of them, by the way, aren't even as sort of fuzzy sounding as that. There are very interesting ways to measure kids' ability to ask good questions or to follow a task from beginning to end and be thoughtful about something. Those would quickly take on the kind of substance that we now sort of give over to these other tests, even though they don't merit. It would take some time. I had so many calls from school principals after a piece of that book came out in the Boston Globe, and I had so many teachers and principals calling me and saying, what would it take to actually make this happen? And the truth is, all it would take is a group of people deciding to do it. I mean, nothing magic about that.
Do you see any groups doing this? Like, do you see any, experimental schools or whatever? And
so
how do you see them doing it?
Well, they're doing it in really interesting ways, and some of them, the saddest part for me, to be totally candid, is that too many of the schools that are brave enough to do this kind of approach, it's not just the measurement, it's the approach and the measurement, are private schools. And the real key is to make this accessible to all. So there are some really interesting public schools dotted all over the country that are moving towards this approach. But it's harder for some of the reasons you just mentioned. It's harder for them to make the leap. And that's what I would like to see happening in the next few years. And actually, there's no reason for them, well, the reason is worry, but concretely speaking, there's really nothing to stop them. For instance, you could say, okay, we know they have to take the paper and pencil test, but we're not going to worry about it. Instead, we're going to emphasize these learning, these ways of learning in school, and we're going to measure them in these 3 ways for the next 5 years, and we'll see what happens. They have very little to lose doing that, actually. But I guess it takes a certain kind of bravery to start with. So I'm open for that. Fingers crossed.
On the bravery part, can you share some insight into how your approach has panned out for you personally with your family?
Oh, so you want me to tell my son's story? This is funny. So I started this, I'll take you back to curiosity. I started this talking to you about how young children have this voracious appetite for all kinds of knowledge. But the truth is, schools aside, it's inevitable that as kids get a little older, their curiosity kind of narrows down. And the reason is, when you're very little, so curiosity is defined as the need to resolve uncertainty or explain the unexpected. And that's sort of the psychological definition of curiosity. So you can understand why when you're 9 months old or 2 years old, everything's unexpected. Everything seems uncertain. You want to know about the juice and the bug and the chair and the door opening and the new face. So you're curious about everything. As you get older, more and more of everyday life gets to be sort of familiar to you. So you begin to narrow your curiosity to things that hold great interest for you, which is why even in the best of environments, by the time your kid is 5, they'll be curious about some things and not about others. And the things they're curious about, they're very curious about. They can't get enough of it. So I have 3 sons. They're grown now. And when we live also in a very rural area, not the one I grew up in, but a different one. And my kids spend a lot of time outdoors and a lot of time with animals and nature. So one time I took my 4-year-old son, Sam, to the Central Park Zoo in New York City. And we went into this space, this beautiful exhibit, the tropical exhibit. And there were lizards and there were gorgeous birds and it was steamy and there were all these cool, probably not as exotic to you, but palm plants and stuff. And there were these tortoises sort of lumbering along in the exhibit. And most of the kids in that room were amazed by everything. I could see them. They couldn't, everything was a surprise to them. But not my son, because he had been to a lot of zoos. He had spent a lot of time with all kinds of animals. He had read a lot of books about animals. So everything that they were, or almost everything that they were doing, he already was familiar with. But one tortoise had lumbered over and made its way, trudged over, and climbed up on the back of another tortoise and was letting out these loud, weird noises. Even my son had not seen that. And suddenly he piped up with his loud, happy little voice. He said, "I know what they're doing, Mom. I know what that is. They're fucking, right, Mom? Those tortoises are fucking." So I tell that story as a way of pointing out that what was exciting and interesting to my son was different than what was exciting and interesting to all the other little kids. So there are 2 final sort of endpoints to that story. My son is 22, and he's about to start his PhD in biology. And so, there's no direct link between those things, but it is true that his great interest in the animal world and the natural world, he already had it then. It was easy to detect, and it sustained itself over time. He's more curious than ever. It's just that now his curiosity is at an ever subtler, deeper level. The only other funny thing I have to tell, because it just happened, is that he he goes to school in another country, and he recently came home and brought his girlfriend to visit in the Northeast, and they went to Central Park Zoo. And, you know, he doesn't remember what happened when he was 4. That's nothing to him. And he came home from taking her to the zoo, and he said, Mom, there's the coolest place at the zoo. It's the tropical area, and there are these cool tortoises. So obviously, at some level, it made a lasting impact on him.
Hi, my name is Alex. I have 2 questions. First one is, current school is a result of long evolution. Yeah. Is it in general, is it needed to fix something there? Because now it is very formal, it is a set of obligations that children should be fulfilled without also with, children who don't have any curiosity, but it covers curious children and not curious, but it works. But what do you think it is need to fix it and to improve, or it works well now and should be keep it as is? And
I don't agree with you. I don't think our current system does work.
Yeah, why?
I think that, first of all, we have an incredibly high illiteracy rate in this country. So there are many children who can't read, and most important, don't read. So one of the things I talk about in The End of the Rainbow is the difference between measuring what a child can do and what they do, what we now call a disposition. And that's much more valuable. So we have kids who some can't demonstrate competence, but even many of those who do don't actually use those kinds of competence in their everyday lives. And I just saw something in the news this morning about how few Americans actually read about the records of the people they're going to vote for. And since we have an election coming up in a year and a half, this seems very relevant. People are making very uninformed decisions about who to vote for. As one example, the cheating in this country is sky high at every level, in school and in business. People cheat one another like crazy and cheat on their work, and that has to do with not having learned how to take care of one another or collaborate when they're in school. So I would say that our current system, while there are a lot, I need to make this clear, there are many terrific schools in this country, and there are many terrific individual teachers. The ideas that I'm suggesting would build on those good practices that are happening. I just think that they're happening in spite of the current system instead of because of it. I don't think our current system is working, and the fact that so many people in their 20s and 30s, maybe not here at Google, but across the country and even here in your community, are doing work that doesn't feel meaningful to them and don't know how to find other things in their life that have meaning, pursuits, is to me evidence that it's not working.
When to think in Google way, it is possible easy to develop some application, for instance, for iPhone, that will measure how many questions per hour children ask in the school and give some report for parents, like your child is very interested in maths but not in language and so on. How useful it could be?
Well, I'm very, first of all, I have to say I'm an inveterate Googler, and I think it's actually really interesting. People always ask me about the dangers of technology when I talk about this stuff. Like, is that going to stop their curiosity? We're just beginning to gather evidence on the impact of technology on the way that children think and learn, but so far, well, it's complicated. You must all know that. It's complicated. Being tied to your phone or your iPad can prevent certain kinds of experiences, social and sensual, but it can allow for others. For instance, getting answers to your questions is one of the most wonderful ways to nurture curiosity. I always liken it to being hungry or wanting to have sex. Those things only feel good if you're going to have a meal or you're about to hook up with someone. And the same is true with curiosity. It only feels good to be curious if you're going to get some satisfaction, some fulfillment for your curiosity. And actually, technology is a wonderful tool for that. What you asked about is whether you could turn an iPhone into a measurer of that. I think that would be a great research tool, and actually I write about this in the book about, and there's some really cool research on tracking people's habits online to see what they're, you probably all know about this better than I do. Do people sort of look at many things, or do they delve deeper and deeper into one thing? There's a great term for that, research rapture, you know, where you start looking and then you got to look at more. And you can track that online when people are doing their searching online. I think that's awesome. I worry about this idea that it's going to be a new thing that parents are going to start measuring like crazy and sort of encouraging their children. But you didn't ask enough questions today. Give me 5 more before you go to sleep. That seems horrible. So that's not what I have in mind. And I don't have the answer to how we, you know, I wrote a book called Red Flags or Red Herrings about parenting a few years ago. And I found myself saying to parents everywhere, you know, parenting is not a job that you get A+ or D on. It's a relationship. And it's when I think about parents who are like trying to make these perfect children, I link it all back to this idea that of money. It has to do with some obsession with getting your kid to be the best. Because if you weren't trying to do that, you would listen to your child's questions and answer them and ask your own questions, and you wouldn't be worried about whether they had asked their quota of questions for the day. So that does worry me. But as a tool for research or for teachers to use, I think it could be awesome.
And my second question is more general.
That was only one question?
1+. And second question about overall or total education. We have it now, but there is no Da Vinci, no Newtons, and Da Vinci was in a century where less than 1% was educated. But now here, and also in Google, we have many scientists who know how to increase our citation level. What do you think, overall education, it is achievement or it is like only background here now in the world?
Okay, I didn't really understand the end part of your question.
Like overall education, like civilization, achievement of the civilization. Like now almost all people are educated. But we have no Beethovens, no Newtons, no Einsteins now.
Who knows? There may be some lurking amongst us. You know, there's a great study that was done years ago by a guy named Barron called the Teddy Roosevelt study, where he took all these people that accomplished great things, and he looked for what they had in common in their childhood. And the only thing that he could find was all of them had spent significant portions of time out of school because they had been too far from school or they had been ill or whatever. And I'm a school lover. I love schools. I've spent my whole life in them. And so I value them deeply. But I think it's possible that actually we haven't made schools places where those qualities that led to Roosevelt or Da Vinci or Newton could emerge. And that relates to my basic idea that if schools were to encourage, I mean, it's a great example because most of the people who have accomplished great things had really single-minded focus on certain things and kind of lapsed at other things. And there's nothing terrible, nor need everybody be Da Vinci. But there would be nothing terrible in having a little more of that in our schools.
Hi. So I want to go back to the topic of this talk, money versus happiness. By the way, I joined Google just a couple of months ago, so it's kind of eerie. Whatever you pointed out for children are actually more applicable to me right now than to children.
Wow, good.
About the curiosity versus measurables and all of that. But, when you compare money against happiness, turns out, happiness is really difficult to pursue. In many cases, money can sometimes be easier to pursue, or at least when you're making progress. So, as a parent, when I look at my own experience, in at Google, everybody says, oh, be curious, this is a different company, it's not your normal company. But the way they let me in here is through some pretty rigorous testing. and I worry about that for my own kid, especially now that I'm at Google. Oh, be googly, have fun, do this, do that, and that's not how I grew up. There were standardized tests, and I did well at them, and I'm at a point in my life where I can be as googly as I want. But is that the right thing to teach my child?
Oh, what a great question. Well, first of all, I don't know you, so I don't know all the qualities that made you googly, a phrase I never knew until just now. But this is not everything. So intelligence is something important, and it's something by and large you're born with. Though without certain privileges like stability and health and basic needs met when you're little, you don't get to sort of fulfill your intellectual capacity. That's why we see big class differences in terms of the measure of intelligence, because if you have good food and a same house to go to every night and conversations, you will fulfill your intellectual capacity more than another kid. But even so, some people are going to be smarter than others. And maybe it's true that Google hires the smartest people. And that's going to be true. I mean, maybe that's why you got hired. And maybe that's why you did well on some of those standardized tests. So I'm not negating that. But there are also many people who are not going to work at Google. And it may be wonderful here, it may be incredible to be googly, but it's not the only place to work, and it's not the only way to be happy. It would be very cool, maybe you've done it, to do some measures of whether people who work here are happier in their lives. That part's going to get cut out of the video.
I smile because we look at things.
Good, cool. I'd love to know more about it. And when I use the word happy, and I take great pains in the book to talk about this, I'm not talking about having fun. So I tell a story in the book about when my children were little, and I had a little kid came over to play, and his mother went home and told his mother, let's play Susan and Jake. That was my eldest boy. And she said, how do you play Susan and Jake? And he said, you be Susan, and you keep saying, want a lollipop? And that's not what I have in mind for happiness. I mean finding fulfillment, finding meaning, working with others. Like I said, seeking knowledge, being able to be thoughtful about things. I think actually if schools were to seriously focus on those things, not just pay lip service. I don't know what googly means. Now I want to know. But if it's just a phrase, it's not much. If it captures something serious about the way people do things here, well, I'm thinking of something similar in schools. And I'm guessing that if kids did those things in schools, many more of them would be well equipped to work environments like this. So, yeah.
We have one more here in the corner. And then I think we're at time, but I'm going to sneak one more question in and go over.
Okay. First of all, I really like what you're talking about is the training for happiness and curiosity and things like that. I've seen it in my own children. We've had to take some out of school because the way that they were taught just wasn't, and we teach them from home. And believe me, even if I've encouraged them, hey, I want you to go into something so I can live off of you. They're not. They all seem to be going art or social type things,
Good for them.
Looking for things that are happy. And I've also seen how the curiosity or the love of learning has just gone out based on a teacher, based off of a textbook and a way it's taught. So I see how that cripples them. My current 16-year-old loves history, but hated social studies last year because the book was frankly awful. But what I kind of say, so I see this is a positive direction. This is what we really need. But how do you do this and keep the bureaucracy and the administration out of it? Because I've seen a lot of good educational ideas, but then they go to the government and they put all this other stuff in, and then by the time it gets back to the schools, it's just a huge mess, and the teachers don't have any control. And this sounds like the teachers got to have complete control, and you've got to really train the teachers up very well in advance on how to be doing this. It's not just something you say, okay, we're going to now do it.
No, I think that's really true, and I think, Regina asked before about whether there are any schools that are doing this. I think we're not making use of the great models that are out there. There are schools that are doing this, and it's not because they're keeping administrators out of it. It's because they have good administrators, and we just need to build on that. The question about government is way beyond my area of expertise. I'm such an optimist, so I'm thinking, no, just change their minds. But I do think that, so E.O. Wilson, who is sort of famous, the most famous biologist really alive, who really developed the idea of biodiversity and is a powerful spokesperson for ecology and for the environment. I was once listened to him speak, and someone said, and I think he's near 90 now, and they said, in the face of all the problems with the way we treat the environment and all the species that have died off and all the problems, how do you have the courage and the oomph to go on promoting these better practices on the earth? And he said, what choice do I have? What's the alternative? And I feel that way about education. So it's been hard to change the minds of administrators or to make schools. That's a whole other talk about how you create the conditions in a school where good teachers can be good. And I think there are clear ways to do that. I don't get discouraged or I don't give up because what choice do I have? So it's just a matter of sticking with it until we make some progress and making use of the really good models that are already out there.
I'm just going to squeeze in the whole, but I'm really concerned about my kid getting into a good school. What about for that question and concern?
Oh boy, I have
especially college.
Yeah, whoops, that's a loud noise. That's okay. So I'm going to quote another educator about this because he said something that I thought was so beautifully put that I got to borrow from him. His name is Alfie Cohen, and he has said to groups of people, how much damage are you willing to do to your child to make sure they get into a school that only appears to be a little bit better than some other school? And what I mean by that, and I'm guessing it's particularly relevant for this kind of a population, is that this idea that there's only a few really good schools is crazy. There are a lot of really good schools. There are so many good, bright young people with PhDs, and they're not all at Stanford, believe it or not. They're all over the country at all kinds of universities and colleges, including community colleges and state universities. The most important thing is that your child wants to go to school and wants to go for the right reasons. And I teach at a very selective college, Williams College. And I can tell you that they all benefit in the more conventional ways from having that degree, but the ones that really benefit are the ones that actually are there to be educated and take something out of college more than just the piece of paper. And that's what parents should be thinking about.
Well, I'm going to end there just from the recording standpoint. Susan's going to be available after. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.